Hey guys, how is it going? Welcome from COVID isolation. Still have COVID. And I'm actually 1 week into my 2 week isolation. I'm feeling much better now, but I still have a cough. So we'll see how it's going to go today. Maybe we'll have to end early. So 1,000 pine points to Kacper for being here first, 500 to Greyback, and 250 to Humble Thinker. So this is take two. Last week, was it a week ago? I think so. When I tried to do this, we ran into some technical difficulties, but I think I figured out how to play a video so that you guys can also hear it and I can hear it as well. But we'll see how it goes. So basically, we are going to be cringing at some apologetics YouTube channel because I'm a little bit of a connoisseur on cringe when it comes to Christian apologetics. And so, yeah, it's called Testified. Testify. It's got about 2,000 subs. And what I find interesting about the channel, and this is the reason why I want to look at it, is that basically the optics, right? So you're gonna see a lot of videos which are framed like this. Some skeptics, such as Bart Ehrman, say this and that. And then what the content of the video is going to be will be criticizing a position that is pretty common in New Testament studies, and it's subscribed to even by very conservative evangelical scholars. And more interestingly, it's going to be a defense of a position which almost nobody holds, not even conservative evangelical New Testament scholars, and not even some Christian apologists, many Christian apologists, I would say. For example, there's a video on the channel defending the Pauline, basically traditional authorship of the New Testament epistles, including the ones that have been recognized as forgeries for like 200 years, right? So if you make a video saying that some skeptics, such as Bart Ehrman, say that not all of the epistles in the New Testament were actually written by the traditional authors, even though these authors were identified as such in all of the early Christian sources, then what's going to happen is that graves will open, and about 200 years worth of dead German scholars are going to come out of the graves. They will enter the city that you live in. They will be seen by many, and they will hunt you down. Because, as we all know, I think the consensus in New Testament studies is actually pretty strong, and we have some data on this, which is really really exciting, because when it comes to New Testament studies, we don't really have that good of an information about distribution of positions that are held by various academics. There are some people that are arguing using various numbers, but the question is where the numbers come from and how well they are actually sourced. But this is a result of a survey that was done in 2011 at a New Testament conference in the UK during a workshop or seminar on the Pauline epistles. There was a questionnaire which was handed to participants, and about 110 or so people actually replied, which might not seem like a lot, but in New Testament studies, it's essentially Woodstock, right? Getting that many people in the same room, some of whom would be the best experts currently alive in this topic, is pretty exciting. And as you can see, the distribution is really interesting. What I find particularly spicy is that when we look at how many people actually think that the Pauline authorship is correct when it comes to some of the epistles which were traditionally, which has long been identified as pseudepigraphical, the numbers are pretty similar, right? So we have 23 for First Timothy, 25 for Titus. So something tells me, even though we can't actually tell from aggregate data, that out of the 25 people who think that the epistle to Titus was written by Paul, 23 people think that First Timothy was actually written by Paul. And that's because in the audience there was about 25 or so American evangelicals, I would imagine, right? Maybe there were some ultra conservative traditionalist Catholic New Testament scholars from, I don't know, Europe, I guess. maybe Eastern Europe, but I don't think so. That would be my guess. Another video that's on the channel is, of course, on undesigned coincidences. I think there is more than one. I want to do probably more than one video on undesigned coincidences, but just if you are a Christian apologist and you are making videos about those, ask yourself a question: why is it the case that that Christian apologists who are actually professionals, right, who do Christian apologetics for a living, don't use undesigned coincidences as often? What's the last time you've seen William Lane Craig bring them up? What's the last time you've seen Mike Lacona bring them up? Do you think they don't know that this is a thing? Do you think they don't know what an undesigned coincidence is? Of course they do. But it is the case that, at least it seems to me, that at any given point in time, there is only about one or two Christian apologists who are actively putting this forward as evidence for eyewitness testimony in the Gospels, the Gospels being historically reliable, them recording something that we would be actually able to videotape if we could travel back in time. So currently, those two or so Christian apologists would be Lydia McGrew with Timothy McGrew, and it would probably be Jonathan McLatchy. And that's about it, right? Nobody else. Not just apologists, but New Testament scholars. When Richard Bauckham wrote his book arguing for eyewitness testimony behind the Gospels, why is it the case that the book is not about undesigned coincidences? Because if undesigned coincidences is such an amazing evidence for eyewitness testimony, that's it. That should be it, right? He shouldn't waste his time arguing about what Papias meant or about inclusio in the Gospel of Mark. We should just write a book about undesigned coincidences. But since William Paley, because not many people know about it, but the first guy who came up with the idea, or at least I'm not actually sure if he was the first guy. The first guy who came up with the idea was probably Plato, right? Because everything goes back to Plato. But the first scholar, I should say, who wrote about this, and he discovered a lot of the undesigned coincidences that are still pointed to today, was William Paley of the young Earth creationism fame. Not that there is anything wrong with that. I'm sure he was a Renaissance man of many talents. But it's actually interesting that it's been around for like 200 years, something like that. And it seems to me that the idea hasn't really caught on even in New Testament studies. So if you think that this is a great argument and it holds weight when it comes to investigating what happened in the past, just get those evangelical New Testament scholars in the same room and just do a seminar on it, because they probably know about it. Otherwise, they would be using it in their argumentation, right? It can't be the case that it's actually crap. But anyway, so what I prepared are 3 videos and that we are going to look at, and we are going to do a review. Isn't that exciting? So let me pull up the chat and let me guys know if you can actually hear it, because I'm not going to record this for the 3rd time. So let's go.
Skeptical New Testament critics like Bart Ehrman say that we have no idea who wrote Matthew's Gospel. Bart, in his own words, says, whoever wrote Matthew didn't call it the Gospel according to Matthew. Persons who gave it that title are telling you who, in their opinion, wrote it. Now, the early church fathers...
All right. So already you can see the optics of the channel. Some skeptics, some critics, such as Bart Ehrman, say that the Gospel of Matthew wasn't actually written by the Matthean author, traditional Matthean author, by Matthew the Apostle, personally handpicked by Jesus in Galilee. A bit too loud. Yeah, that might be an issue. Okay, so let me see if I can actually make it a little bit more quiet. Advanced properties. Let's do -10. Okay. Yeah, so some critics, such as Bart Ehrman, disagree with the idea that the Gospel of Matthew was written by Matthew the Apostle, the tax collector from Galilee. Well, that's actually interesting. Do you know who else doesn't buy Matthean authorship? Richard Bauckham, the guy who actually wrote the book, and he's actually one of the few. I would say probably one of two New Testament scholars who are now actively putting forward arguments for eyewitness testimony behind the Gospels, even he doesn't buy the traditional authorship of the Gospel of Matthew. Why is that? Why is it the case? If the arguments for the Matthean authorship are really good, why isn't Richard Bauckham on board? That's actually a really interesting question. And I have read his book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, and he basically says that he doesn't think the author of the Gospel of Matthew was Matthew in like one place in the book. And I always had the impression that he just mentions it off the cuff. And it's actually super spicy, because I would think that if you're writing a scholarly work about eyewitness testimony in the Gospels, it would take up much more space than that, because that's actually a really interesting admission that you don't think that the Gospel of Matthew was written by Matthew. And one of the reasons that he gives for thinking that this is probably not the case is the list of the apostles, because of course in different Gospels and in Acts we have two different lists of apostles, right? The 12 apostles, and the names on the list are not the same. Now, of course, this isn't a contradiction, because there are no contradictions. It's actually possible to harmonize any apparent or supposed contradiction. And I have a standing challenge for Christians, actually for theists. Give me a contradiction, apparent contradiction, in any religious worldview, any scripture, and I will be able to harmonize it using the same tools that Christian apologists, such as Lydia McGrew, use to harmonize gospel differences. You can always do it, right? Usually you can go with additive harmonization, which means you just add things together. So normally what you would do, and this is what apologists do, for example, with the numbers and identity of women at the tomb, is you would just add the sources together. So instead of every source telling their own story, you just create a new source that tells a new story, and it's just the two stories combined. But in this case, it doesn't work, because in both sources actually tell us that there were 12 disciples which are picked by Jesus. So you can't actually combine the names from the lists to give you more people. You still need to land at 12. So the way how Christian apologists deal with that is that they actually say that both lists record the same 12 people. It's just some people had multiple names, and some lists only give one name, and so one of the lists only gives one of the names, and the other list gives the other name. Fair enough. The problem is that it would actually require Hebrews, because the 12 apostles would be Hebrews, right? It would actually require them to have multiple Hebrew names, which is something that we don't have any evidence for in literary sources, in archaeological sources, right? Which is, of course, argument from silence, but in this case, the silence is pretty deafening, because if it was the case that Hebrews had multiple names, it would show up somewhere by now, right? We would have examples of that showing up in ancient literature. We would have examples of that showing up in inscriptions, maybe on tombstones, but it's not the case. Hebrew males only had one name. If they, for example, had Roman citizenship, they would have two names, but one of those two names would be the name of the person who would work as their legal guardian, let's say, when it comes to dealing with the Roman state. For example, Josephus was Josephus Flavius. Josephus was his name. That's the Greek form. And Flavius was a family name of the Roman family, which acted as his legal guardian, as an intermediary between him as a free person, as a Roman citizen, and the Roman state, in which case it was the Flavian family, the family of Vespasian and the Flavian emperors, right? But so that could be the case, but what we actually don't see are Hebrew individuals, Jewish individuals, who have multiple Jewish names. So plausibility of that harmonization is actually really, really low. And which means the harmonization is probably not correct. It could be correct. It's possible. that harmonization being true doesn't entail any logical contradiction, nor is it metaphysically impossible, but it's actually pretty improbable. The explanation in the harmonization relies on something being the case that we actually never see in ancient sources, as far as I'm aware of, right? Which means that harmonization isn't probably correct. And then the best explanation is that actually the two different lists of two different 12 apostles are just record different people, which means there's an error in the Bible. There's a contradiction. Both lists can't be correct. And because it would be pretty weird to imagine that the Gospel of Matthew, being written by Matthew the apostle, would make a mistake about identity of the people on the list, well, then it becomes probable that it wasn't probably Matthew the apostle who wrote it. This is what Richard Bauckham thinks. This is what he says in the book. Super interesting. So let's get back to the video. So the key takeaway is this isn't just some skeptics, some critics, such as Mike Lacono, right? But you can kind of already see where the boundaries between the different tribes are being drawn in the cinematic universe of this video.
All agree that Matthew wrote it, and all the ancient manuscript evidence that we have attributes it to Matthew. We've actually looked at this in previous videos. So what are the main reasons Ehrman thinks that someone other than Matthew wrote it? Well, the first reason is that Barth thinks there's nothing in the text that would make you believe that the author is talking about himself. He always refers to himself in the third person. Here's what Ehrman has to say, and I quote, "Matthew's gospel is written completely in the third person about what they, Jesus and the disciples, were doing. Never about what we, Jesus and the rest of us, were doing. Even when this gospel narrates the event of Matthew being called to become a disciple, it talks about him, not about me. Read the account for yourself in Matthew 9:9. There's not a thing in the world that would make you suspect that the author is talking about himself." Problem with this complaint is that Augustine answered it nearly 1600 years ago. There was a guy by the name of Faustus the Manichaean who was the first person that we know of questioned the authorship of the gospel.
Yeah, that's actually not true. We know from Epiphanius of Salamis, who was active in the 4th century CE, that there was a group of Christians which were, of course, considered heretics, who were active in the 2nd century CE, so less than 100 years possibly after the Gospels were written, who already doubted authorship of the book of Revelation, Revelation of John, and the Gospel of John. They claim that it's written by Kerinthos, who was a early Christian author. Why did they have that view? Is it the case that they had some like super reliable historical information? Probably not. More often than not, in early Christian history, these claims of authorship were very closely tied to theological disputes and theological matters. So essentially, if there was a piece of writing that agreed with your theology, you were much more likely to believe that it goes back to the apostles. And if a piece of writing disagreed with your theology, then you were much more likely to believe it was written by someone else, that it doesn't have apostolic authority. So this group of early Christians didn't like the Revelation of John. The Revelation of John was actually fairly controversial, right, when it comes to its authorship and by extension its apostolic status. And they didn't like the Gospel of John. So they concluded it can't be written by one of the apostles, because it can't be the case that one of the people personally handpicked by Jesus would hold heretical teachings. Right? We don't like the theology, therefore it must have been written by someone else. And there are some examples of how this worked in early Christianity. My favorite example is narrated by Eusebius of Caesarea, who was a Christian historian, and he mentions, just off the cuff, a guy named Serapion of Antioch, who was a patriarch in Antioch, I think in the 2nd century CE, who basically went through a tour through various Christian churches, and in Egypt, he was told that the church in question reads from a gospel written by Peter, and apparently he was asked to sanction the usage of the gospel. He didn't even bother to read the gospel. He said essentially, effectively, well, if it was written by Peter, then it must be okay, right? Because, come on, it's got apostolic authority. So he sanctioned it. And at some point later, when he was already back in Antioch, someone wrote him and explain basically that the gospel can't be by Peter because it's heretical. Specifically, it has some Docetist teachings, right? So Serapion finally got the copy of the gospel, read it for himself, and he wrote a refutation of the gospel because he recognized that yeah, there are some heretical teachings and that it shouldn't definitely be read from, right? Which is really interesting because already it shows you that if there was a claim of apostolic authority, at least some people were willing to take the text at face value to a point that they didn't even bother to read it. But also, it worked the other way around, right? So when it turned out that there is something theologically defective about the text, then it was automatically, it seems, concluded that it can't have apostolic authority. It can't go back to the apostles, right? It can't be the case that, for example, Peter was the author. There wasn't any kind of historical investigation done, right? Serapion didn't actually try to investigate if it could be the case that this gospel really goes back to Peter. No, it disagreed with his theology. Therefore, he concluded it can't possibly be by Peter. So he couldn't imagine that, for all he knows, it actually is by Peter, right? Just people thought something other than what he believed. So yeah, so that's just a false claim in the video. But it's definitely true that when it comes to the Gospel of Matthew, the early Christian attestation is uniform. As far as I know, the first author who identifies the early Christian author who identifies Matthew the Apostle as the author of the Gospel of Matthew is Origenes from Alexandria in 3rd century CE.
Skeptical New Testament.
Oh fuck! Now it's started again. Okay, let's
Skeptical
listen to
New
it again.
Testament critics like Bart Ehrman say that we have no idea who wrote Matthew's gospel. Bart, in his own words, says, whoever wrote Matthew didn't call it the gospel according to Matthew. Persons who gave it that title are telling you who, in their opinion, wrote it. Now, the early church fathers all agree that Matthew wrote it, and all the ancient manuscript evidence that we have attributes it to Matthew.
That's also true.
We've actually looked at this in previous videos. So, what are the main reasons Ehrman thinks that someone other than Matthew wrote it? Well, the first reason is that Bart thinks there's nothing in the text that would make you believe that the author is talking about himself. He always refers to himself in the third person. Here's what Ehrman has to say, and I quote, Matthew's gospel is written completely in the third person about what they, Jesus and the disciples, were doing. They're about what we, Jesus and the rest of us, were doing. Even when this gospel narrates the event of Matthew being called to become a disciple, it talks about him, not about me. Read the account for yourself in Matthew 9:9. There's not a thing in the world that would make you suspect that the author is talking about himself. Problem with this complaint is that Augustine answered it nearly 1600 years ago. There was a guy by the name of Faustus the Manichaean who was the first person that we know of questioned the authorship of the gospel, and Augustine wasn't having any of it. Here's what he has to say. Augustine writes, Faustus thinks himself wonderfully clever in proving that Matthew is not the writer of this gospel, because when speaking of his own election, he says not he saw me and said to me, follow me, but he saw him and said to him, follow me. This must have been said either in ignorance or from a design to mislead. Faustus can hardly be so ignorant as to have not read or heard that narrators, when speaking of themselves, often use a construction as if speaking of another. It is more probable that Faustus wished to bewilder those more ignorant than himself in hope of getting a hold on not a few unacquainted with these things. It is needless to resort to the other writings to quote examples of this construction from profane authors for the information of our friends and for the refutation of Faustus. Wow, talk about a mic drop moment.
Yeah, okay. So there is a lot of posturing like this in the video. So Bart Ehrman will be given strikes, and there will be mic drop moments, right? Okay, so what's the problem with this? It's definitely true that there are instances of ancient authors who refer to themselves in the third person, but we need to be a little bit more specific than that. Would we really expect someone like Matthew, on the hypothesis that the author of the Gospel of Matthew is actually Matthew the Apostle, to talk about himself in the third person? This is the question that you need to ask when you're doing a historical investigation. One of the things that you need to ask yourself is, what's the expectedness of the evidence that we do have on your hypothesis? And is there any evidence that we would also expect to have, but we don't have, if your hypothesis was actually true? So was there a reason on the hypothesis that the Gospel of Matthew was written by Matthew for the author to talk about himself in the third person? Not really. Especially if you think, and a lot of Christian apologists do want to say that the genre of the Gospel is Greco-Roman historical biography, which means that the Gospels would be in the same genre as the works of Plutarch or Tacitus, for example. They usually love to say that. Why? Well, because they think that if they can establish the genre of the Gospels as Greco-Roman historiography, well, that immediately should boost our confidence in their content, because after all, we accept what Plutarch wrote about history, right? We accept what Tacitus wrote about history, right? So therefore, if it's the same genre, we should accept what the Gospels say about history, right? Or at least it should make our confidence higher. But this is actually a two-edged sword, and I already have a video about it on the channel. And the problem is that when it comes to ancient Greco-Roman historiography, not just Greco-Roman historiography, but actually, for example, when it comes to Jewish historiography, when an author is an eyewitness to events, he says so himself. Because why wouldn't he? There's every reason for him to say that. There's no reason for him not to say that. There are some reasons that we are going to go into a little bit later, but I'll actually show you how those reasons are not applicable to the Gospels. Eyewitness testimony was very highly praised in ancient historiography. Historians praised each other for using eyewitness testimony. They criticized each other for not using eyewitness testimony and relying on hearsay. There even was a saying in ancient literature, in the ancient world, which was, eyes are surer than ears, which means it's better for you to see something with your own eyes than to hear about it. And of course, an author writing a historical account would want to volunteer the information that he was an eyewitness to the event, if that was the case. And we have many, many examples of that, which I'm very briefly going, which I am going to very briefly go over and show you guys. Because an apologist could make the argument that literary conventions were actually different in the ancient world, and that ancient authors wrote differently than we do today. So we shouldn't expect someone like Matthew the Apostle to write the Gospel of Matthew in the first person. But I'm here to tell you that no, that's actually not the case. If the author of the Gospel of Matthew was Matthew the Apostle, who was an eyewitness to many of the events, for example, his own call to be an apostle, we would absolutely expect him to say so in the first person about himself, because that's what we consistently see in other ancient works, especially in works of Greco-Roman historiography. So let's go through some examples. Of course, we have all of the people who specifically name themselves in the text. These are the researches of Herodotus of Halicarnassus. This is actually the first extant historian, Greek historian. I have elsewhere he says, all I have said is the record of my own autopsy. I myself have seen. We have, of course, Thucydides, the Athenian, wrote the history of the war. I certainly all along remember from the beginning to the end of the war. So he talks about himself in the first person. When he narrates the Great Plague, which hit Athens in the second year of the war, he says, I had the plague myself. Because why wouldn't he? He wants to say that. It makes the account more interesting. It makes him more credible as an author. There's no reason why he would talk about himself in the third person. He does in one place, where he is actively participating in the events, but he still indicates that it's him speaking. So he says, they sent the other commander in Thrace, Thucydides, son of Oloros, the author of this history. So if the author of the Gospel of Matthew was Matthew the Apostle, and he was using the same literary conventions as Thucydides, we would absolutely expect him to say, and then he called Matthew Levi, the author of this account. That would actually be consistent with what we are seeing in the ancient literature. Then we have, for example, Polybius. I was not only an eyewitness, but in some cases one of the actors, and in other, the chief director. So here, he's saying that I wasn't only an eyewitness, I actually actively participated, I shaped the events. And he gives examples, many examples actually. He specifically says that he interviewed eyewitnesses. He says how he influenced the events. So again, if the Gospel of Matthew was written using the same literary considerations, we would absolutely expect the author to say, I was not only an eyewitness, I was one of the active participators in the events, because the apostles as a group do participate in the events, which would include Matthew, right? Again, we have Polybius, who repeats the saying, eyes are surer than ears. He criticizes a historian named Timaeus because he entirely retrained from looking at things with his own eyes. However, he then later quotes this same historian, Timaeus, as saying, I am not now proceeding on conjecture, but I have investigated the truth in the course of a personal visit to the Locrians in Greece. So here, Timaeus is actually volunteering the information that what he's saying doesn't come from conjecture, it doesn't come from hearsay, or it doesn't come from just his recreation or invention of some plausible account, which is what ancient historians did as well. No, he actually personally went there, right? We have biographies of Plutarch. He says, for example, when I was traveling through the plain, Mestrius Florus, one of the men of consular rank, who were at the time with Otho, pointed me to an ancient temple. So Plutarch is writing a biography of Otho, one of the Roman emperors, and when the narration interjects with his own personal experiences, he says that. He says, look, I was traveling with this guy who pointed me to this temple. There are other examples like this when he's writing a biography of Thucydides, of Themistocles, famous Athenian general. He mentions that he knew one of Thucydides' descendants, because Thucydides lived, I want to say, about 500 years before, actually more than that, more than 500 years before Plutarch's own time. So Plutarch obviously wouldn't be an eyewitness to the life of Themistocles, but he happened to know one of his very, very distant descendants. And he volunteered that information. He was very happy to say that his personal life was connected to the life of the person that he's writing about, even though the actual person is like 500 years removed from him. This is how ancient authors wrote. This is normal. It's not unusual. It's not extraordinary. It's actually the standard. So if the Gospel of Matthew was written by an eyewitness, we would expect him to say that. Lucian wrote a biography of Demonax. I saw and marveled at both of them, the philosopher and a different guy. Cassius Dio, a historian, I was present myself and took part in everything seen, heard, and spoken. And this is in the part of the work where he gets to narrating events that he participated in, when he was an eyewitness, right? So his historiography actually covers several centuries, for which most of which he would obviously not be an eyewitness. But when he actually gets to narration of the events that he participated personally in, that he personally witnessed, he says that, because why wouldn't he, right? It just makes sense. Herodian, another ancient author. But it is my intent to write a chronological account of the exploits of many emperors over a period of 70 years, exploits about which I have knowledge from personal experience. But let's keep going. Porphyry, who wrote the biography of Plotinus. I myself, Porphyry of Tyre, was one of Plotinus's very closest friends. Okay, seems kind of boastful. Maybe it would be a little bit sinful, but hey, we can at least expect Matthew the Apostle to write something a little bit more humble. Right? I myself, Matthew the Apostle, was maybe not one of the closest friends of Jesus, but hey, I knew him. I knew the guy. Cornelius Nepos. So here we are getting to Roman historians. His biography of Atticus. I myself heard him proudly assert. So again, he actually knew Atticus, so he says that, because why wouldn't he, right? Tacitus, he writes about his own father-in-law, and he says that. So he's actually writing a biography of Agricola, and he says, look, it's my father-in-law, because why wouldn't he, right? And elsewhere in the biography, he actually indicates that he got various pieces of information that he's reporting from personal interaction with Agricola. Even in his histories, in the introduction, he's actually explaining what his own position was in relation to the events. He says, I myself knew nothing of Galba, of Otho, or of Vitellius, either from benefits or from injuries. I would not deny that my elevation was begun by Vespasian, augmented by Titus, and still further advanced by Domitian. So here he actually explains what his own relationship is to the events. Again, if the Gospel of Matthew was written by Matthew the Apostle, we would absolutely expect him to express this, right? Because it was normal. Suetonius, in several places. When I was a boy, I had a small statue of him. This isn't just some anecdote. He actually uses that as a piece of evidence for some kind of historical claim, right? I recall being present in my own youth when the person of a man 90 years old was examined before the procurator, and so on, right? So when he has eyewitness testimony, he says that. Meanus Marcellinus, a large part of his surviving historiography is actually covering events that he himself participated in. He says so. The imperial command had attached me. And there are many, many instances where he talks about events that he personally witnessed. He was, for example, present during a military campaign and during a battle in which Emperor Julian, the apostate, died. Aurelius Victor, I was born in the country of a poor and uneducated father. Wouldn't it be nice if the Gospel of Matthew said, I was born to a family of publicans, tax collectors, and I became a tax collector myself? Again, that would be consistent with what we find in the primary sources. Let's get to Jewish historians. Josephus actually talks about himself in all of his 4 extant writings. In the Antiquities of the Jews, he says, I was myself interested in that war and knew myself its particular actions. Of course he's going to say that because he was actually one of the leaders of the Jewish rebels in the war, right? In the Jewish war, he says, I have proposed myself to write a history, and he even gives his full name, Joseph, son of Matthias, by birth Hebrew, a priest also, and so on and so forth. We have Christian historians. So if the Gospel of Matthew was written by Matthew the Apostle, this is how it would look like. These are specifically early Christian, ancient Christian examples. I, Hegesippus, conversed with them on my way to Rome. So this is a fragment from a lost historiographical work written by a guy named Hegesippus. I think he was active in the 2nd century, although I'm not sure. It might be 3rd. But there you go, right? This is quoted in Eusebius. And also in some of the other genres, for example, martyrological and hagiographical literature, there are many claims of eyewitness testimony found. Because, again, if it is the case that you are an eyewitness, why wouldn't you say so? So, for example, in Lives of the Jura Fathers, it says, I saw the deeds with my own eyes. These are biographies of influential early Christian monks, essentially. And then, of course, we have all of the claims in apocryphal literature. So the eyewitness testimony was actually so highly praised and so highly valued that people forged it all the time. We have examples from of that from Greek and Roman historiography. We have, of course, examples of that from ancient Jewish literature. We have a lot of Old Testament apocrypha, which is forged in names of various patriarchs and prophets. We have Ascension of Isaiah, Testament of Job, Testament of Jacob, First Enoch, right? And the trend continued in early Christianity. But I, Simon Peter, and Andrew, my brother, took our nets. This is found in the Gospel of Peter. Why is it the case that the Gospel of Peter forged that? Well, because the author realized that this is going to make the account look more credible. He realized that if it was the case that a book was written by an eyewitness, the eyewitness claim would appear in the book. So he wouldn't, like, if it was the case, if it was plausible that someone like Matthew, the apostle, would write the Gospel of Matthew, then the author of the Gospel of Peter wouldn't feel the need to put this explicit claim of eyewitness testimony into the text. But because it was actually common for works written by eyewitnesses to explicitly include an eyewitness claim, the author of the Gospel of Peter wrote it that way. He wrote, "But I, Simon Peter, and Matthew, my brother," right? The same goes, for example, for Infancy Gospel of Thomas, and for some of these other works. Yep, so let's get back to the video. So essentially, and by the way, here's a great question, right? So if what I'm saying is true, why is it the case that Augustine of Hippo responded this way? So just to reiterate what the context is, it was pointed out that the author of the Gospel of Matthew never claims to be Matthew already in antiquity, to which Augustine of Hippo responded by saying that narrators sometimes write about themselves in the third person. Now, obviously, Augustine was living in antiquity, he was living in the ancient times, so he would know, right? So why is it the case that this is his response? Well, the answer is simple. He's an apologist. What else should he say? He can't concede that, yeah, this is actually a good point, and we would totally expect someone like the author of the Gospel of Matthew to say that he is an eyewitness if he is an eyewitness, because this is what normally authors do. No, he of course needs to defend the traditional authorship, right? Because by then, it was already taken as, well, the gospel truth. And it was, of course, very advantageous for his specific flavor of Christianity to argue that the texts which support his theological views have apostolic authority. So really, Augustine saying this isn't Augustine speaking from a position of authority, being someone living in antiquity and being familiar with what's plausible and implausible in antiquity. This is just an example of a Christian apologist who practices the strategy, which is still practiced today, of just say anything, right? If there is an objection that you cannot respond to, just say anything, and it almost doesn't matter what you say. So this is why Augustine says that. Not because he was in some privileged position to know what is historically plausible or not. He certainly wasn't in a better position to know than us, given that we have like hundreds of years of critical historical research behind us. No, it's just being an apologist. So here we have one apologist citing another apologist. Just one of them has been dead for a long time.
Augustine said that he wouldn't point out the profane authors, but I'll give you a few examples. The first century Jewish historian Josephus refers to himself in the third person in his book, The Jewish War.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, Josephus actually talks about himself extensively in all four of his surviving writings. Specifically in the Jewish War, he talks about himself in the third person. He introduces himself, and he explains that he is the author of the account and also one of the participators. When later he shows up as a character, he talks about himself in the third person, but for the audience member who is already familiar with the introduction to the work, they would know that this is the author speaking, because he explained that this is the case in the introduction, right? So if the Gospel of Matthew actually used the same conventions as Josephus, this is how it would look like. It would open by the author saying, "Hi, I'm Matthew Levi, one of the apostles, a tax collector who was personally handpicked by Jesus in Galilee." And then it would go on to narrate events in the third person, including, for example, the call to Levi. This is not what we find in the Gospel of Matthew. So this is disanalogous.
Josephus wrote in one place, "However, in this extreme distress, he was not destitute of his usual sagacity, but trusting himself to the providence of God, he put his life into hazard." Then there's the renowned Greek historian Xenophon. Writing around 400 years BC, he writes, "There was a man in the army named Xenophon, an Athenian." And we won't even go into all the times that Julius Caesar refers to himself in the third person.
Yeah, okay, so these are the usual two examples, right? So when apologists are trying to establish that it's plausible for someone like Matthew the Apostle to write the Gospel of Matthew and never indicate that he's actually an eyewitness and that he's one of the characters, named characters in the Gospel, they bring up Xenophon and they bring up Julius Caesar. And interestingly enough, when it comes to Xenophon, they only ever bring up Anabasis because, of course, in other works, Xenophon does indicate that he has information from eyewitness experience, eyewitness testimony, right? For example, in Chiropedia, which is a novel essentially about a life of Cyrus the Great. It's a didactic novel. It's not supposed to be very historically reliable, and it's not. But even in that work, he discusses various aspects of Persian society. And for example, in one place, he says, and I from personal experience can tell you that the Persians are still doing this. Why does he say that? Well, because he was personally present in Persia, right? So even though he's writing about Cyrus the Great, who lived like centuries ago, and he of course wasn't an eyewitness to the life of Cyrus the Great, if he can drop into the narrative the information that what he is describing is based on his personal eyewitness testimony, he does that. Because why wouldn't he, right? It makes it more interesting. He says, look, I myself was in Persia, and I can verify that this is what they are still doing to this day, right? So that's one thing. So what's interesting about Anabasis? Well, both in Anabasis and in Caesar's commentary, the thing is that the author is also the main character. So it would be actually very self-congratulatory to write it in the first person, right? Anabasis was actually, there is some evidence that Anabasis was actually originally written under a pen name. So Xenophon published it claiming that it was written by someone else other than him, specifically for the reason that he didn't want it to sound very self-congratulatory. He's elected actually as one of the generals in the army after the original generals are captured, executed by the Persians, and he's trying to, of course, make his accomplishments seem a little bit smaller, but he's one of the chief architects of the successful escape from the Persian Empire of the entire army of the 10,000 Greeks, right, which were stranded in the Persian Empire. You guys know Anabasis, right, by Xenophon. I don't have to explain what is it about. But basically the point is that probably the reason why Xenophon wrote it under a pen name is because he's one of the main characters. He is basically narrating his own accomplishments. So it would be too self-congratulatory. And there is a hypothesis that he actually wrote it specifically in reply to a different account of the same events, which were previously written by someone else who was also there. And Xenophon didn't like that version. We don't know why. Could be because he felt he wasn't given enough credit. So he just wrote his own version. And that was already a precarious situation, right? Because he was writing his own version in order to show his own accomplishments. So it would be perceived as very self-congratulatory to write it in the first person. And the same goes essentially for Julius Caesar, right? He's writing about himself, about how he is an amazing general and how he's winning every battle and massacring hundreds of thousands of French and Swiss and German people, or at least their distant ancestors, right? And also in terms of commentary, commentary is a specific genre. It's a pre-historiographical genre in the Roman environment. It evolved from a specific type of legal text where civil servants, after their tenure ended, have to give a written account of their tenure, essentially. It originally probably mostly covered their financial expenses, so how they spent public money, which they were entrusted with from the public treasury, but it developed into an account of what they were essentially doing, like a historiographical account of their tenure. And then it later developed into a historiographical genre that we already see in Caesar's own time, right? Caesar isn't writing as a civil servant. It's not primarily a report for the Senate to go to the archive. He's writing it as a piece of political propaganda. But this genre, and what's important is it seems to be the case that in this technical legal genre of commentary, it was already a custom for the civil servant to refer to themselves in the third person. Again, because it would be perceived as self-congratulatory. Now, do these considerations apply to the Gospels? Absolutely not, right? Because in the Gospels, the traditional authors are not the main characters. In case of the Gospel of Mark, and in case of the Gospel of Luke, they don't even show up anywhere in the narrative. But in the Gospel of John and in the Gospel of Matthew, specifically talking about the Gospel of Matthew now, Matthew isn't the main character. So there's absolutely no reason for him not to write in the first person when he's talking about events that he personally participated in, when he's writing about himself, right? This objection or this counterexample to what I'm saying would only work if it was actually Jesus who was the traditional author, right? If the Gospels, or one of the Gospels, was attributed to Jesus himself, then you could make a case that an author like that would write it in the third person because he didn't want the account to be perceived essentially as too self-congratulatory, given that he's like walking on water and stuff like that, right? But that's not the case. So this isn't a valid counterexample. So let's move on.
He's famous for it. So Augustine is right. This wasn't an uncommon thing at all for ancient writers to do. That's strike one for Bart. So why else is it doubtful that Matthew wrote a gospel? Bart claims that Matthew was in all likelihood illiterate. On his blog, Ehrman writes, and I quote, "The vast majority of Palestinian Jews in this period were illiterate, probably around 97%. The exceptions were urban elites. There is nothing to suggest that Matthew the tax collector was an urban elite who was highly educated." Now, I gotta say, I'm a little baffled by Bart here. There's nothing to suggest that Matthew couldn't read or write in Hebrew and Greek. I mean, let's think about this one for just a moment. Matthew was a tax collector in Galilee of the Gentiles. This might have required the ability to read and write. Now, we know from history that ancient students took notes from their teachers. I'm sure the thought had to occur to the disciples, hey, we might want to write this down. If that's the case, who would they have picked?
Okay, that's just a unsubstantiated assertion. It's possible. Do we have any evidence of that? The second objection is essentially that it's implausible that someone in Matthew's position would be able to compose something like the gospel. And here, I think it really shows that the person who made the video doesn't have the background in classics, in ancient history, and they are essentially, or he is essentially, just working from his common sense. But in this case, this common sense approach doesn't really accurately depict what was the case in antiquity. Because there was actually a very important difference when it comes to literacy and how literacy worked in the ancient world compared to today. So in the modern world, we are, of course, all children of the Enlightenment, and we live in a society of universal literacy, and most importantly, we live in a society of universal general education, which is not, and people take it for granted, right? Like the way how we approach written word, how we write, how we read, and how we work with texts is very, very strongly shaped by universal general education that everyone receives, at least in the developed world, right? And we take it for granted. It's been like this at least since the Prussians, because the US basically copied its educational system from Prussia. And it's been so ingrained in us that we don't think about it. But in pre-Enlightenment society, literacy actually worked very, very differently. Literacy actually worked on different levels. Today, just because pretty much everyone goes through pretty much the same curriculum in the same kind of educational setting, we get a very high, very good literacy, and it's distributed pretty uniformly in the society. Sure, there are people who are much better working with texts, reading, and stuff like that. And there are people that are much worse. But the differences are not massive. this wasn't the case in the ancient world, right? I actually thought of a really good analogy how to explain it. In the ancient world, the ability to read and write came in different tiers, in different levels. Similarly to how today the ability to do very complicated math comes in very different tiers and different levels, right? So think of the ability to do math. The normal person probably can do simple calculations like addition, subtraction, multiplication, and stuff like that. They might be able to do like simple algebraic equation because everyone does that in school, right? So those would be people on like the lowest tier of math literacy, right? Then there are people on a higher level. For example, let's say accountants, people who do accounting, insurance, mathematics, right? People who are high school teachers. They would probably be able to do things like probability calculus, combinatorics, goniometry, and stuff like that. So those would be like your second tier. And then you would have higher and higher tiers, people who are specifically trained to do math really well and do it very, very complicated. So those would be your college professors, for example. Those would be your data scientists, data analysts, such as myself. Those would be your theoretical physicists. Those would be probably on like the highest level, right? So when we are talking about math, it becomes very, very obvious that even though everyone can count, not everyone is able to accomplish the same tasks when it comes to mathematics, right? So I can count, I went through the educational system, but that absolutely in no way means that I would be able to do, let's say, some very complex mathematics, right? Derivation or something. I would be probably able to still do derivations, but like I wouldn't be able to calculate very complex mathematics that's involved in like astrophysics, right? I just don't have the level of mastery of mathematics that's required. And in the ancient world, it was a little bit similar with literacy. Of course, this is just an analogy, so it doesn't work perfectly. But the point of contact is that in ancient society, just because the level of inequality in social position between people, their access to wealth, access to education, and stuff like that, much more primitive educational methods, for example, were the case, right? The differences in literacy were much, much more pronounced. So vast majority of people wouldn't be able to read or write in any language, including their native language. So those would be on like a level 0, right? Those would be equivalent to people who can't do math at all, which is pretty rare in like our society. Then people on the first level, so people who would be equivalent to someone that can do basic addition, subtraction, and stuff like that, subtraction, would be people who are able to, for example, sign themselves using some few letters, and they might be able to read like really basic texts or individual words, for example, on a some kind of account, right? For accounting. Then people on a slightly higher level would be people who could compose maybe a simple letter, who could compose a simple legal text, like for interacting with the government, with the authorities, right? And then even on the higher level would be people who are able to put together an original composition of some artistic quality. And then on the very highest level would be people who are essentially the authors of literature that we have today, surviving literature. They were extremely educated, they were extremely wealthy usually, they didn't have jobs, they were aristocrats, so their income came from their property, essentially, from landed property usually, or from trade, from mercantile activities, but they didn't have a profession, right? They didn't have to wake up every morning and go to work, and they didn't receive any salary or wages usually, right? So literature was just their pastime activity, essentially. There are, of course, exceptions to that, but this is like a general rule. And we actually have many, many examples of different texts produced by people on different levels of literacy. We have most of the ancient writings that we actually have are from people on the very highest level of this pyramid of literacy. So those would be the professionals, essentially people who receive the best training in composing and working with ancient texts, rhetoricians, and so on. But we also have some examples of people on lower levels of literacy. We have inscriptions, we have graffiti in places like Thera or Pompeii, where graffiti was actually preserved by volcanic ash. We have, of course, fragments of papyri, mostly from Egypt, where we have examples of, let's say, day-to-day literature, everyday texts, letters, court documents, and stuff like that. We know that people could hire someone who can write. This is the case, for example, in the even in the New Testament, where probably most of the letters of Paul were not actually written by Paul. Maybe Paul just wrote a small section in the end, but they were actually written by someone else, and Paul just dictated it to them. So the question is, on this hierarchy of literacy, where a Galilean tax collector would sit. And the argument is that he wouldn't have the sufficient level of literacy that would allow him to compose something like the Gospel of Matthew. He would have some level of literacy, but not enough. So essentially, proposing that the author of the Gospel of Matthew was a tax collector is like proposing that an author of a very sophisticated journal article about theoretical physics is a high school teacher. Could it be the case? Not very probable, right? If you open a random journal and you pull up a random article, chances are the author is probably not going to be a high school teacher. It's probably going to be a college professor who does this for a living. There are, of course, exceptions. Albert Einstein, very famously, was a civil servant, right? But those are exceptions. Those are not typical. And in history, you're dealing with probabilities. So that's the main thrust of the argument. You can, of course, ask yourself, well, couldn't Matthew, the apostle, ask someone to write the gospel for them? So couldn't he hire someone who could read and write? Well, it's not just about the ability to write down the letters. It's about the ability to compose the text, to work with the text, right? There is some kind of certain level of artistic skills, which comes with a certain level of literacy. And that's not something that someone like a tax collector would have. So that's the argument. Let's move on.
Let's see, we got fisherman, tax collector. In his commentary on Matthew, R.T. France says, the little we know about individuals who made up the original apostolic group indicates that Matthew was better equipped than most of his previous profession for the role of gospel writer. And in his book, Misquoting Jesus, Ehrman...
Yeah, this is actually really interesting. So Matthew was better equipped. Sure, but that's not saying much. It's just saying that everyone else was even worse than him, right? So it's not saying he was sufficiently equipped. It's just saying he was better equipped. So everyone else had a even lower level of literacy, probably.
Himself admits that tax collectors required some reading and writing skills. He writes, throughout most of antiquity, since most people could not write, there were local readers and writers who hired out their services to people who needed to conduct business that required written text, including, number one, tax receipts. Plus, we do have many Jewish burial inscriptions from the 1st century that are written completely in Greek. So the notion...
Yeah, but not gospels. There is a difference between being able to write a name on a tomb and being able to compose a gospel. There's also a difference between being able to write a tax receipt and being able to write a gospel. That's like a difference between being able to solve a simple algebraic equation and being able to solve an equation in quantum physics, right?
that the kind of Greek that we find in the Gospels is foreign to the context of the time of Jesus just isn't historical. This objection, I have to say, is pretty weak sauce, and that's strike 2 for Bart. Probably one of the better objections against Matthean authorship is Matthew's use of Mark's Gospel. If Matthew's an apostle, why would he use a Gospel written by a non-eyewitness? That does seem to be a bit weird. Well, for starters, there is some scholarly dissent about the popular idea that Mark's Gospel came first. Now, it's definitely a minority position, and I don't have a dog in the fight.
Yeah, this is really interesting. So he says he doesn't have a dog in the fight, but it seems to me that he would much rather have Matthean priority, because it would make this problem less severe, but also because that's what the early Christian sources say. It's actually really interesting when it comes to attestation to the Gospel of Matthew, and when it comes to the origin of the Gospel of Matthew, early Christian authors who write about it make a number of claims, and every single claim they make is false that we can check. For example, they say that the author of the Gospel of Matthew wrote first. Traditionally, I think the date of composition is 43 CE, if I'm not mistaken. That's the year when Matthew wrote the Gospel of Matthew, according to tradition. But that's false. We actually can tell because we are smart and we have hundreds of years of scholarship behind us that Mark actually wrote first. Matthean priority is an overwhelming consensus for a good reason. It then, for example, says the early Christian attestation to the origin of the Gospel of Matthew says that it was originally written in Hebrew. And later it was translated into Greek because Matthew was a Hebrew, right? He was a tax collector in Galilee and he has a Hebrew name. Well, that's false. The Gospel of Matthew wasn't written in Hebrew. It was originally written in Greek. How can we tell? Again, because we can tell what the original language of her work was, right? If something was written in one language and then it was translated into a different language, we can tell. There is a very large number of early Christian texts which only survive because they were preserved by the Ethiopian church, which means that the oldest surviving manuscripts are in Ethiopian. In some cases, they are as late as 17th century, right? But we know still that we can tell whether they were originally written in Greek, whether they were originally written in Hebrew, because you can spot a translation, right? Of course, doesn't work 100%. It's always a matter of probability. But again, the consensus that the Gospel of Matthew was originally in Greek today is pretty strong. So if what it takes to defend Matthean authorship is Matthean priority, then this is essentially piling fringe positions on top of fringe positions. If your conclusion is fringe, then you should at least have it based on mainstream premises. But if your conclusion is fringe and it's supported by fringe premises, then there's like much less reason, all the less reason for someone like me to take it seriously, right? So let's go on.
Let's go ahead and grant that Mark did really come first. There is plenty of historical evidence that suggests that Mark based his gospel on Peter's preaching. If Peter was the 12's leader, then there's nothing implausible about Matthew using it as a source. After all, why reinvent the wheel?
Why reinvent the wheel? So what's going on, right? So this guy is granting that Mark wrote first, and the issue is that Mark is supposedly based on the eyewitness testimony of Peter, and Matthew was supposedly an eyewitness as well. So here we have essentially two texts that both go back to eyewitnesses to the event. But the problem is that one of the texts essentially copies the other one. A very large percentage, I would say as much as 80% of the content of the Gospel of Mark is also found in the Gospel of Matthew, including very long strings of verbal word-for-word agreement. Like, again, I've already done streams on this. I already showed you guys how this works. There are entire sentences that are exactly identical in both Gospels. And from that, we can tell that the author of the Gospel of Matthew, when he was writing the Gospel of Mark, had a copy of the Gospel of Mark in front of them as he was writing. Now, is that really something that you would expect to see if it was the case that the author of the Gospel of Matthew was an eyewitness himself? No, he would just write his own account, right? He was write it in his own words. How can we tell? Well, because that's how people do it. So this guy is essentially saying, look, if it's the case that the Gospel of Mark is based on eyewitness testimony of Peter, which I don't think is the case, and I think the arguments put forward for it are pretty weak sauce, then it would make sense for someone in Matthew's position to use the Gospel of Mark as a template and essentially copy it and alter it in places. Why? Well, why reinvent the wheel? Well, why reinvent the wheel? Because that's what people do, right? We have examples, many examples, of multiple different accounts written by eyewitnesses describing the same events. We have examples of that in ancient literature. We have examples of that in contemporary literature, and actually in literature all throughout history, right? And that's just not what people do. When two different eyewitnesses to the same event write an account of those events, they just write it in their own words. Even in situations when they actually use the other account as a blueprint, right? So if we have two eyewitnesses to some historical event, let's say 9/11, and they are interested in writing an account about how the information went, how the event went, it's what's not going to be the case is that one of them will take an existing account, copy it in many places word for word, tweak it, and never acknowledge that this is what they're actually doing, right? It would be one thing if the author of the Gospel of Matthew actually tell us, look, I'm using an existing account, an account which goes back to Peter, and I'm just changing it, and I'm using it as a blueprint for my own version because I regard Peter in a high authority, right? That would be one thing. It would still be very unexpected. It would still be unprecedented. We don't really have examples of that in ancient literature. But at least that would be something, right? But, and this is something that people very often don't realize, imagine if the Gospel of Mark was lost and we actually didn't have it. We would never know, just from having the Gospel of of Matthew and having the Gospel of Luke, that there was such a thing as a Gospel of Mark, right? I guess we would know, well, we wouldn't know actually, because if we only had those two, then we wouldn't know necessarily that they are using the same source. We could also hypothesize that one is using the other as a source, right? So both the author of the Gospel of Luke and the author of the Gospel of Matthew are using Mark's account, but they don't acknowledge it, which is super spicy. So this is something that is, again, completely unprecedented, certainly in ancient literature. And I can give you an example of where we would be able to see it if the hypothesis that is being proposed about the relationship between the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Matthew was the case. We have several, well, actually two extant apologies of Socrates. Socrates very famously was trialed and he was sentenced to death and he went through the execution. So he actually died. And this made a great impact on people around him. So much so that a genre of literature actually evolved, and that was an apology or defense of Socrates. During the trial, Socrates gave a speech before the court. He actually gave 3 speeches, at least 2 speeches before the court. We don't have, obviously, the records of, or an account of the actual speech that he gave. But it became a custom for authors in antiquity to write essentially a fictional speech of Socrates And in some cases, the people in question were eyewitnesses to the trial of Socrates, or they had access to eyewitnesses. We know of several different speeches, defense speeches, apologies of Socrates, but we have two extant examples. One was written by Plato, who actually was an eyewitness to the trial of Socrates, and the other one was written by Xenophon, who was an eyewitness, but in the speech he says that he's using an eyewitness source as his source of information, right? So here we have a situation which is essentially identical or equivalent to the situation with the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Matthew. We have the same event, and we have two different accounts. One of those accounts was written by an eyewitness, and the other account was written by someone who has access to an eyewitness. The first case, that would be Plato and the Gospel of Matthew, and the other case, it would be Xenophon and the Gospel of Mark. Now, what do we see when we compare those two accounts? Do we find that Plato took the apology of Xenophon, copied it, in many cases word for word, and just tweak it and publish it without acknowledging that this is what's happening? Of course not. He just wrote his own version. So the hypothesis that's being proposed for the literary relationship between the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Matthew is something that we never see in literature. It's just not how people work. It's not how people write eyewitness accounts. So again, is it possible? Of course it is. Is it probable? No. If it was probable, we would see people doing it all the time, right? And history is about probabilities. And just to, as an aside, of course, the apology of Plato and apology of Socrates are contradictory. They are contradictory in terms of what Socrates says. Actually, the entire content of the speech and the way how Socrates approaches his own defense is different, right? I would say that so different they're irreconcilable. And then, of course, there are certain historical details which are also contradictory. For example, the punishment that Socrates is supposed to propose for himself is, if I'm not mistaken, is different in these two speeches. Now, would it be possible to harmonize if someone was interested in doing that, using the same strategies that Christian apologists are using to harmonize the Gospels? Of course, it would be possible, because you can always harmonize everything, right? But of course, specialists in Socrates and in ancient philosophy don't harmonize it because they don't feel any need to, because nothing is at stake. They just recognize that different authors were free to compose an original version, which is different from what actually happened in the past, even though they were eyewitnesses around who would be able to identify that the content of the speech is not what was actually said by Socrates during the trial, but this was an accepted literary practice. Everyone understood that this is going on. Nobody was considering it to be deceptive or lying, and everyone was just enjoying themselves, and they were having a great time. This is the problem with the scenario, right? If the Gospel of Matthew was written by an eyewitness, then he would just write his own version. He wouldn't take an existing version, copy it, tweak it, and never acknowledge that this is what's going on. Why? Well, because people don't do it. And even in ancient literature, in situations which are equivalent to what is being imagined for the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Mark, this is not what we are seeing, because it's not actually very probable. So let's plow through the video.
So we have historical examples of eyewitnesses who used testimonies of others when composing ancient biographies. The ancient Greek historian Xenophon was a disciple of Socrates, but he used reports from Hermogenes, another disciple. The reason was Xenophon wasn't at the trial and death of Socrates, where Hermogenes was. Likewise, Matthew doesn't enter into the picture of his own gospel until chapter 9.
Okay, cool. So here we have a supposed example of what's being proposed. So Xenophon wasn't personally present during the trial of Socrates, so he's relying on a testimony of Hermogenes, who actually was present during the trial. So first of all, this obviously doesn't work because Matthew, the supposed author of the Gospel of Matthew, copies from Mark word for word in many cases, even events that he would be present to. For example, his own call, the call of Matthew or Levi in the Gospel of Mark and in the Gospel of Matthew is almost exactly identical. So this doesn't work, right? Xenophon had to rely on testimony of Hermogenes because he wasn't there, so he could not have written his own account. So that's one thing. And the second thing, how do we know that Xenophon was actually using testimony of Hermogenes? What's the attestation for that claim? Well, in this case, we know that because Xenophon fucking says so himself. In the introduction to Xenophon's version of Apology of Socrates, he says, "It seems to me fitting to hand down to our memory furthermore how Socrates, on being indicted, deliberated on his defense and on his end, so on and so forth. Hermogenes, the son of Hipponicus, however, was a companion of his, and has given us reports of such a nature as to show that the sublimity of his speech was appropriate to the resolve he had made." I'm not going to read the first paragraph, but I'm saying that in the first paragraph, he essentially says that the people who wrote about it in the past, and he could be referring to Plato, didn't do well enough job, and that this Hermogenes, who was an eyewitness, is better. For he stated that on seeing Socrates discussing any and every subject rather than the trial, he had said, and this is where the eyewitness section begins. So how do we know that Hermogenes was actually used by Xenophon as a source? Well, because Xenophon says so. This is exactly what we don't see in the Gospel of Matthew. If these two situations were analogous, if these two examples were analogous, then we would absolutely expect the author of the Gospel of Matthew to say, look, I'm basing this on an account which goes back to Peter. Why? Well, because Peter was there and because he's a great, reliable witness. That's not what we find. If we didn't have the Gospel of Mark, we wouldn't know that it existed, at least not based on us having the Gospel of Matthew, right? Because Matthew just copies 80% of it, and he never even mentions that this is what he's doing. Because he wasn't an eyewitness. He just wants to produce a different version of the gospel. Because he doesn't like the Gospel of Matthew. That's why he changed, right?
And he would have been one of the disciples who fled the scene when the Romans arrested Jesus in Matthew 26. That means there's several chapters of content that he wouldn't be directly present in. It's not like the apostles were witnesses to everything that happened in the life of Jesus, and Matthew still has his own unique content. So that's strike 3 for the critics. Now, you can argue that Mark is a
For the critics, such as Richard Bockham,
faulty source and he makes historical goofs, and Matthew, if he were an eyewitness, should have known better. I don't think that argument works, and we'll dig into those accusations about Mark's gospel in the future. But for now, these 3 objections against the traditional authorship of Matthew aren't all that compelling. I believe that we're more than justified for believing that Matthew wrote Matthew's gospel.
Cool, so that was one video out of 3, and I'm completely out of energy. So let's go to see what's happening in the chat, and maybe we're going to wrap it up. I will fast forward in my slides to something completely different, of course, and that's how we are going to close this. So yeah, there's going to be part 2 to this, and probably part 3 as well. To be fair, out of the 3 videos that I wanted to cover, this was the most substantial, so that was the most that I wanted to say to it, just because, yeah, defending the Matthean authorship of the Gospel of Matthew. Like, what is this? Did Norman Geisler rise from the dead? And did he transform himself into a Christian apologist in ages 18 to 25? And is he now making YouTube videos? Is that the case? So what's happening in the chat? How is everyone doing? Some of the Gospels also use Homer. I'm not sold on that. I think that's just parallelomania. It's like there is a lot of really weak points that of contact that you can like point to where the Gospels, it looks like they're using Homer, but the problem is that the Homeric epics are pretty long. There is a lot of stuff happening in them. So the probability that you would be able to find these points of contact, especially if they are so weak, is actually pretty high, even if there was no literary dependency. That's why I don't buy it. Like the data that's being presented is maybe acceptable, is maybe expected on the hypothesis that the Homeric epics were used, but I think they are also expected on the hypothesis that these are just random similarities, right? Okay. It's Andy is all the way down in the chat. Jesus Christ. There is a guy who has an icon with the cross. Is he causing trouble? Should I ban him because he's not from our tribe? So I have COVID. I haven't even coughed once. That's great. Are you and your family feeling better? Do you want some COVID drama? Sure, I'll give you some COVID drama. I have absolutely no idea how I got infected because I don't go anywhere. And kindergartens are closed. They have been closed for a couple of weeks. So my daughter doesn't go anywhere. She has nowhere to catch it, I guess. I got it first, at least I had the symptoms. And my wife has 2 shots of Pfizer. For a couple of months because she's working in social services. So my best guess is, because I like wearing face mask and stuff like that, is that I got it from a surface, actually, in like a public space, in a shop or something like that. That's the only way how it could get into my system, right? So I had symptoms for, I don't know, maybe 3 days. It was a little bit uncomfortable. Then my daughter had mild fever, and my wife just had mild symptoms as well, and now we are fine. It's a little bit like it persists a little bit longer than a normal flu, because I'm still like coughing after a week now, but otherwise it's perfectly fine. I didn't hear any of us lose either sense of smell or taste, which sucks because I was actually looking forward to it, right? Like everyone describes how it's a strange feeling, but I didn't really have it. So maybe next time when a new mutation arrives, the symptoms will be more interesting. And I've been extremely tired. That's probably the most like unpleasant thing about it. Like everyone says that, yeah, you get pretty tired, and yeah, that's definitely the case. I got infected from Logue's book. I already had it when we were reviewing. I have to say I'm not at all happy with how I did at the review. My takes were not nearly as hot as they could have been, but I have a really good excuse. I had a virus that killed like hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people globally already. So, yeah. You swearing in the name you don't believe in, Jesus Christ, hypocrite. What can I say, right? I am an atheist, so obviously I don't have any moral values. I tried to live a decent life for a while, but then Dennis Prager told me that I can't justify my morality, so I thought, why should I even try? I wonder what this guy thinks about Michael Lacona. Well, actually, this guy, as many other small YouTube apologist channels, is the ultimate enlightened centrist. So he quotes both Mike Lacona and Lydia McGrew. I think he's aware of the controversy between them, but he's not acknowledging it, obviously. He's probably smart enough to realize that house divided against itself will not stand. Does Sweden have herd immunity yet? I don't know. I'm not from Sweden. Do I look like a Swede? And is it a good thing? Probably not, right? Because in Sweden, when you learn that someone murdered your son, your reaction is, we were not close. Okay, so let's fast forward to something completely different. So skip. This is all stuff that I had for the other videos, which we are going to do later. So now for something completely different. It's going to be short because I was counted on me having some symptoms. So this is just something that I find really cute. We have preserved letters by Pliny the Younger, who was a member of aristocracy in the 2nd century CE. And he was actually a contemporary of Tacitus, who is a great ancient historiographer. He's actually the 3rd best ancient historian, according to my own top 10 list of ancient historians, right? So they were contemporaries, and they actually knew each other, and they exchanged letters. And a number of letters by Pliny the Younger were actually written specifically, addressed specifically to Tacitus. So there is a very rare case where we have two people that we know from history. And in this case, it's even rarer because those are two authors. And in both cases, we actually do have their writings, right? So for Pliny, we have the letters, which he himself published. That was normal to write letters to your friends, then edit them maybe a little bit, and then publish them as a literary work. That's something that people don't really do today anymore. But in the past, and actually quite recently on a historical scale, published letters was actually a genre of literature that people were interested in. And in the case of Tacitus, we of course have his historical writings. So, and what I find really cute is how how Pliny is actually valuing his friendship with Tacitus very highly. And what I find really interesting, and this gets me every time, is that Pliny, in those letters, is actually talking about whether people in the future will actually remember them, which I find super, super interesting. So let's look at some examples. I have often again left the Senate House with just as much glory as I had hoped to obtain, but I never felt greater gratification than I did a little while ago at something which Cornelius Tacitus told me in conversation. He said that he was sitting by the side of a certain individual at the last Circensian, probably, games, and that after they had had a long and learned talk on a variety of subjects, his acquaintance said to him, "Are you from Italy or the provinces?" Tacitus replied, "You know me quite well, and that from the books of mine you have read." Then, said the man, you are either Tacitus or Pliny. Isn't that cute? So this is something that Pliny wrote in a letter. In this case, it's addressed to someone else. It's not to Tacitus, right? But he's super proud of his bromance with Tacitus, and he's super excited that someone actually wasn't able to tell whether it's Tacitus or Pliny. That's one example. And the second example is super cool as well, because this is actually addressed to Tacitus, and Pliny is talking about how people in the future might actually remember them. So this is essentially Pliny writing almost 2,000 years ago about us. Though you never praise your own work, I, for my part, never write with such confidence as when I'm writing about you. I don't know whether posterity will trouble itself about us, but we assuredly deserve that it should pay us some attention. I will not say because of our genius, for that would hardly be modest, but because of our studies, our hard work, and the respect we have always shown to the generations that will succeed us. So let us go in the old way, which has certainly lifted a number of people out of the gloom and silence of obscurity, though it may only have brought a few into the full light of great reputation. Farewell. Doesn't this just send shivers down your spine? This is just, I don't know whether the posterity will trouble itself about us, but we assuredly deserve that it should pay us some attention. Just think about how mind-boggling it is that out of the billions of people who lived in the past, just happened to have information, not even extant works, but just information surviving, that these two people existed, right? Just think about like millions and millions of people who lived and died in Central Asia or Central Americas, where there were entire civilizations, right, which rose and fell, and we don't know about them because they, for example, didn't use a permanent writing material that would be preserved. Or maybe their writings were preserved, but they got lost or destroyed, right? But in this case, we have Pliny, who is wondering about whether future generation, which will succeed them, remember them. That's amazing, right? And they should, because of the respect we have always shown to the generations which will succeed us. And the last thing is something that always sends shivers down my spine every time I read it. I am really charmed to think that if those who come after us are interested in us at all, the tale will everywhere be told how you and I lived together as devoted, frank, and loyal friends. So that's just some positive vibes. And let's go back to the cesspool that is the chat, and let's see what's going on. Who appended the Testimonium Flavianum to Josephus? Was it Eusebius? I don't know. He's as good as a candidate as anyone. Polybius is pretty good to read. Polybius is the best ancient historian, right? So let me reveal the official ranking. The best ancient historian, no competition, is Polybius, because he is a genuine critical thinker. He asks really good research questions, legitimate like hypotheses that you would absolutely could research today. He has good methodology. And what's also cute about him is that when it comes to describing affairs where he is personally biased, he completely fails as a historian. He becomes insanely partisan all of a sudden. But when he's writing about something else, he's amazing. So I just like him because of that. He's a really good historian, but then just completely flies off the wall. The second best historian is Thucydides, and the third best historian is Tacitus. And then there's no one else for a long time. And then maybe Herodotus, just because he's an amazing at narrating complete nonsense. Okay. I wonder if the people of the future will read this humble live chat. From the respect we have always shown to the Pine Point. Yeah, who knows, right? Maybe this is going to be like the 1% of 1% of all the content that will survive. Probably not, right? At some 2,000 years from now, we're probably not going to have it. So there you go. Do I want to do an after show? Probably not. You can just quote yourself. You are not as cool as Loke. I actually quote myself all the time. Like in you can look up some of the like papers and journal articles and stuff like that I wrote in the past when I was a political scientist. And yeah, I quote myself all the time. Is that something that you're not supposed to do? Because like I think the idea is that you're not supposed to quote yourself because academic citations of your own work are used to establish like how influential your work is. And the easiest way how to cheat it is that if you yourself quote yourself, right, or cite yourself. But I think now it's very easy to filter for that. And I'm pretty sure that these academic indexes filter for that anyway. So I don't think it's unethical. Like if you have research that you've done in the past and it's like you think it's a valuable work and you want to point people to that, you should be able to do it. I don't think there's any problem with that. Like I, for example, when I was a political scientist, I was using some statistical methods that nobody was using at the time in the country. So all of the existing research, pretty much on that, using the methodology, was done by me. So in every paper, the only person that I could cite was myself and like 3 other guys, right? So yeah. I guess that's a show for tonight. And given that we have some content ready that I haven't been able to go through, I guess I'll see you guys next week. Yeah, there's probably no reason for me not to stream next week. So have a nice week and bye.